Hello and welcome to Movie Marathon Mood. It's the show where we watch a bunch of movies and then we talk about them. On this episode, we're beginning a journey into the film career of none other than Mel Brooks. We'll be talking about his first two films as a director, one legendary to his career, The Producers, and the second, Undersung, The 12 Chairs. It's a lot to talk about, and it's all right here on Movie Marathon Mood, which starts right now. Hi, I'm Jesse Ghostrap, and this episode is something different than what we've done on the channel so far. I'm kind of blending two different worlds together on this episode. You see, back in 2011, I started writing a blog over on iceboxcentral.blogspot.com. I'll be sure to put a link in the description, but since 2011, I've written hundreds of blog entries. The idea behind the blog is to do entire filmographies. I started with Disney Animation Studio, and I've done a few other studio filmographies as well with Lucasfilm. But mostly, I've done the filmographies of directors from Stanley Kubrick to Steven Spielberg to Ang Lee to Catherine Bigelow to Martin Scorsese and on and on. It's a lot of fun. Well, my type of fun. And it involves a healthy dose of research and analysis to consider the entire filmographies of these many directors. And it is also often insightful in ways that I might not have always considered when looking at each movie as they were released and thinking about the flow of a director's career, the state of the world when a movie was made, the state of cinema, the evolution therein. Alfred Hitchcock, for instance, was a hefty assignment with so many movies and a career that moves through cinema history from the silent era to sound, black and white to color, a move to widescreen and even panoramic widescreen to his last couple of movies being made with the introduction of the MPAA ratings code. It was an incredible journey. And all that being said, today we're going to start a conversation on Mel Brooks, filmmaker, in essentially that same style. But Brooks, on top of being a director, also has his own production company, Brooks Films, where things become even more interesting. And on this journey, we'll be talking about his work as a director, but also the output of Brooks Films, which is quite the legacy. First of all, though, it's worth mentioning that Brooks's career didn't start with directing The Producers. He was born a poor Jewish guy in New York. He learned to love Broadway, dreamed of making a Broadway show, and after serving in World War II, he didn't quite make it to the theater yet, though he did talk with folks in the theater, including one Broadway creator who financed movies by sleeping around with rich old women, and mentioned to Brooks that one could theoretically make more money with a flop than with a hit. The foundation for The Producers was there in the back of Brooks's mind. Meanwhile, though, he became friends with Sid Caesar and was a writer on Caesar's Your Show of Shows, which was a hugely popular TV show. Eventually, Brooks had his own fame with the routine that he did with Carl Reiner called The 2,000-Year-Old Man. They'd been doing this routine just for laughs, off mic, off camera, at parties, and, well, everywhere, really. Someone convinced them to record it, and many successful albums were made, compiled from them just riffing. They had to edit down their just ad libs into something palatable to actually be an album. Reiner would ask questions of Brooks, Brooks pretending to have been alive for different huge historical periods. Brooks would then create Get Smart on television, another big success, and all of this goodwill was built behind this guy, who nonetheless had not been a director. He had a lot of ideas, but he hadn't really been given quite the control that he started to want more of. The idea in the back of his mind returned of a producer sleeping around with rich old women for money, hoping to finance a flop of a Broadway show so that he could pocket the money. It became the story of The Producers, with a relatively low budget, with a director that had seen a lot of show business but didn't really have quite the experience to know what he was in for either. This led to plenty of temperamental moments on set and a reliance on the more seasoned crew around him, but it wasn't easy. I'm reminded actually of when I was in high school. It's the late 1990s, early 2000s, and I was an officer in FBLA, Future Business Leaders of America. We went to a conference at one point in North Carolina, me and my fellow officers in a big charter bus, which was plenty large for, just a small handful of us that were on the trip, but still confined for, 12 hours being on a bus ride. Uh, on the 12-hour ride back home, I pulled out a couple of VHS tapes. One was Spaceballs, and the other was The Producers. And our advisor tried to give me some advice that Spaceballs would go over better with the crowd. But I wanted to show them something that they hadn't seen that was great. That if they could just get past any misgivings, that they would learn to love. And it wasn't long into The Producers that I sensed my error. Nobody had to pay attention to a movie on a bus, and everyone became occupied, to themselves, ignored the movie altogether. I was happy, but I debated switching out the tape to something that they might love more. Over 20 years later, watching The Producers again for this review, it struck me that this movie certainly feels like it came from 1967. I don't think that should be a hang up. Just to be clear, I can appreciate that its style nonetheless might be a tough entry point for some. By all means, I think more people should try out more older movies, but The Producers probably shouldn't be the first Brooks movie for newbies, great as I believe it is. In many ways, Brooks is offering in a new era and a new style for comedy that influence is still felt today, but certainly he has a theatrical style and a love for vaudeville touches. The filmmaking, though, in The Producers feels like 1967. And a part of that is that it was low budget and it had a relatively inexperienced director. In fact, a completely inexperienced director. He never directed before that. He had ideas about directing, but this was his first go at it. In the opening credits, you can really sense this, I think. The rhythm of the humor is interrupted with still images and title cards and loud music. The particulars are amusing, the stuff that's actually happening within the credits, but the style is immediately a barrier, I think, for some viewers. Composer John Morris does his first feature here, and while I like his swings as a musician, the broad style could be a bit much at the start. Nonetheless, I like his work. It absolutely fits the movie, especially with the music of the songs, like Springtime for Hitler and Prisoners of Love, which were themselves written by Brooks. Of course, the songs are a highlight. Springtime for Hitler is hilarious, irreverent, and a brilliant exercise of comedy from a Jewish guy who fought in World War II. When it happens in the movie, the crowd is aghast, and our main protagonist, hoping for a flop of a show so he can make more money, is exuberant. This whole stretch in the movie where the Broadway show within the film is finally on display is the part that I feel most viewers could accept today, that this movie is brilliant. It happens, however, deep into the film. I'm certainly not suggesting that the earlier stuff is bad. Far from it, but some of it is certainly of its era. Take Dick Shawn as LSD, for instance. Shawn had been in It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. Very clear to put those four mads in there. It's a mad, 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 mad world. And LSD is a great comic creation of a character. A swinging hippie wanders into the auditions to play Hitler. Our title characters, the producers themselves, are delighted to imagine such a spacey presence playing Hitler. I love the character, but he is so much of the 1960s. That character was written out decades later when Brooks actually turned the story into a Broadway show. But more on that in a later episode. Dick Shawn is hilarious and is so charismatic, he accidentally turned Springtime for Hitler into a hit. The one bad idea too far. The film was shot by Joseph F. Coffey, who doesn't have many credits as a cinematographer, and while I wouldn't say he does a bad job with the look of this movie, it isn't especially striking either. It sometimes feels too claustrophobic for the humor. Editor Ralph Rosenblum had done movies like Failsafe before and would eventually edit Annie Hall, but he and Brooks apparently butted heads. Brooks had somehow secured Final Cut as a first-time feature director, but if you don't get along with an editor, that can't really help. The movie doesn't always flow like it should either. I bring up these technical things because I feel like they aren't awful. It's just that they aren't perfect, and they could be issues for modern viewers especially. Ultimately, one needs to focus on the sharp dialogue of a brilliant humorist, the hilarious concept of the story, and, importantly, the ace cast. And that includes Zero Mostel as Max Bialystok. Mostel had been a long-time screen presence, but especially a stage legend. And along the way, he had lots of drama. He had been blacklisted, unjustly called a communist in ways that hampered his career. And then he was hit by a bus, refusing to amputate a leg that gave him much pain and suffering for the rest of his life. All of this drama seems fused into the character of Max Bialystok, who is bitter and he's cynical and he's willing to go low to make money. Mostel is so definitive in this part and so convincing, all down to watching his demeanor shift throughout with his friendship with a new partner, an accountant named Leo Bloom. Brooks almost had Peter Sellers as Leo Bloom, but Sellers disappeared after accepting the part, although Sellers would later be instrumental in helping the movie get a proper release after the studio was wanting to shelve the whole thing. Desperate to have someone as Bloom, Brooks turned to his wife, Anne Bancroft, who had acted with Gene Wilder on the stage. Thus, a wonderful partnership was born when Wilder stepped in and was so amazing as Bloom. This is a man who's so insecure that he carries with him a little blue blanket. The chemistry between Mostel and Wilder is excellent, and both actors command these parts and are so funny. Watching Wilder have breakdowns is some of the best stuff in the film. Of course, the supporting cast is also brilliant and considerably eccentric. Christopher Hewitt plays Roger Debris, the flamboyant man the producers bring on as a director, somebody with many flops to his credit, and Hewitt is joyous as this mindless man. Wikipedia mentions that his sexuality is only suggested in the 1967 film, but made explicit in the later Broadway show, but I don't believe there's room for much doubt in this movie, in the 67 movie, about his sexuality. Kenneth Mars, who had been in an episode of Get Smart, plays Franz Liebkind, the man who wrote the terrible play Springtime for Hitler. He's a Nazi man with religious fervor for his beloved Fuhrer. His devotion is hilariously portrayed by Mars, especially as he is increasingly upset at how his love letter of a play to Hitler becomes less like his own vision. I'll also shout out Lee Meredith as Ula, a woman hired by Bialystok to be his secretary, but who's really there as a distraction in more ways than one. Her moments of joyous dancing come at all the right moments, especially toward the end, when an unhinged Liebkind seeking the producers who ruined his script burst in. I've seen before people list the works of different artists as beginner's level or intermediate or advanced slash expert. And the producers, in my opinion, would fall as intermediate. Unless you are already highly familiar with the comedies of the 1960s, you probably shouldn't start here. And certainly not start here just to familiarize yourself with who Mel Brooks is as a comic filmmaker. That probably would seem like a strange sentiment. When the producers has become considered a classic and is absolutely one of his most definitive stories, but this is especially true when it became a smash Broadway hit. In its time, it wasn't a huge success and it had mixed reviews, but it certainly had its fans. The people that loved it really did, and it even won Best Original Screenplay for Mel Brooks at the Oscars, and Gene Wilder was nominated for Best Supporting Actor, an award that ultimately went to Jack Albertson in The Subject Was Roses, which is a movie I know absolutely nothing about, but I now know that it is a drama. Brooks dove into the deep end to learn directing, and in certain circles to producers was beloved. I certainly love it, and I would give the film a solid A grade. The antic-comedy energy works where it works. The cast is so stellar, and the satirical approach is so on point. That energy from the producers was enough to propel Brooks to his second feature, The 12 Chairs. If The Producers is intermediate level as a Brooks film, then I would put The 12 Chairs as expert level because, critically celebrated at the time, it's now a nearly forgotten movie that offers a peek at what might have been a very different career for Brooks as a director. It certainly is still a comedy with touches of the absurd within it, but it's a relatively straightforward tale that is adapted from a 1928 Russian novel. The 12 Chairs book has been adapted into a fairly high number of different productions, but none have been made since the 1970s. Once again, suggesting the highly period nature of this kind of tale. It is set in the Soviet Union of 1927, and Brooks shot the movie in Yugoslavia. He proved himself with the producers as a director in a trial by fire. But here he took that experience and then decided to go on a location shoot, adapting a celebrated novel, certainly pushing himself into a less satirical realm than his directorial career would ultimately end up. If the film had made even more of a mark, he might have continued on a more story-driven, character-based route and perhaps directed even more serious movies. Certainly this movie has traces of a more serious world, as a former aristocrat ends up befriending a local con man to help find one of 12 chairs that had jewels sewn up in the bottom that would make them rich. Brooks even altered the ending to be less dark, to highlight the friendship at the center, something that the original novelists no doubt believed in themselves when they wrote a sequel that brought a dead character back to life. I'm kind of reminded uh, of Michael Crichton, and he wrote The Lost World as a sequel to Jurassic Park, uh, because in the Lost World, Crichton brought back his own dead characters, characters that had died in Jurassic Park, partially out of an affection for those characters. In Brooks's 12 Chairs movie, we are in this more realistic world overall, but it is also heavily farcical. The version of Brooks that grew as a director and made different types of genres later as a producer possibly could have refined what this film was even more. As is, I feel that it doesn't entirely come together quite as well as it could have. Editor Alan Heim, who would later work on many classics, including winning an Oscar for All That Jazz, does okay work here. But I feel similarly to the producers that the pacing isn't always there. And that includes, anytime you have to resort to sped up footage, I feel like there might be a question about the pace of the action. I'm not saying sped up film never works, but I find it to be a cheap gag, and it might be a sign of Brooks being, again, somewhat over his head. Wonderful as it must have been to shoot a film on location in Yugoslavia, that is a sharp change from how the producers worked, and how almost everything Brooks had worked on behind the scenes to that point too. He'd never worked on location. He'd been making shows on stages, and he had a love for theater. So, of course, shooting in Yugoslavia was going to be a sharp change. Brooks, in his autobiography, All About Me, he wrote about how poor the production experience was on this film. There was such a lack of technology, and all in an area where people didn't speak the same language. I have a feeling that this sort of thing didn't help the 12 chairs when it comes to finding a rhythm. Furthermore, while there are some different kinds of sequences throughout, it gets kind of old seeing our characters attempting to acquire antique chairs, smashing them up in hopes of finding jewels. There's a repetitive nature to the story that keeps it from being as inventive as it could be, with even more development outside of the plot. The film suffers tonally when it isn't quite zany enough, not quite serious enough, nor quite character driven enough to make it clear what the film truly is. Ron Moody had just been Oscar nominated for Oliver. He's a terrific performer who increasingly falls into a bit of mania. It's easy to see this man's desperation, even if I would like to feel it even more. The great Frank Langella plays alongside Moody as a rogue swindler who wants his piece of the pie. It once again could be nice to see even more about who this guy is instead of just understanding that he's a thief and a trickster. But Langella is absolutely charming here. Funny enough, Gene Wilder wanted to play the Langella part, but Brooks noted that the novel describes the character as devilishly handsome, so he didn't want to cast Wilder. Wilder wasn't deeply hurt by this, though I do think he would have been terrific, honestly. That doesn't change the fact that Langella is excellent, and seeing him so young, so dashing, it's a lot of fun. The interplay between him and Moody helps the movie a lot, since it's meant to be centered on these two guys, ultimately. But I found myself wanting even more drama too, besides just enjoying the antics. Speaking of antics, Dom DeLuise makes his debut in a Brooks film here, portraying a particularly pathetic character meant to be a comic foil that also wants the jewels, but is sniveling and selfish. I suppose he's meant to be so pathetic that we don't want him to have the jewels, but this once again speaks to the film needing to have a touch more drama just to distinguish these characters even more. DeLuise is funny though, and gets some truly pathetic moments, especially when getting himself stuck on top of a steep, rocky climb. Brooks even pops up on camera himself here, something he'll do a lot more of soon enough in his movies. Very next time he makes a movie, he's in it a lot more. The cinematographer, whose name is, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, uh, George Nikolic, but it's DJORDJE, and then Nikolic. But he's a native of Yugoslavia, and I'm not sure how much that benefited Brooks when it came to establishing the visual look of the movie. Again, Brooks described how awful shooting there was, trying to accomplish or communicate much of anything to his crew or to crowds of extras. And while the end result certainly could have been way more disastrous, I'm not sure that what we get fully gels either. The film is an outlier in Brooks's filmography, though, looking very different with its on location stylings. John Morris returns from the producers for the score, which works well, certainly keeps the film flowing, including moments that aren't as farcical. I just wish the film found a tone that fully worked. When Ron Moody and Frank Langella find themselves pretending to be part of an acting troupe to gain access to some of the chairs, it leads to some okay comedy, could be even broader. When they discover that the jewels had already been found and used to buy a lavish estate, I wish the moment had even more weight to it, or even if the moment was even more of a slap to the face. After a somewhat repetitive plot, it just feels weak to reach a point where the jewels have already been discovered, and yet it also feels inevitable. And that's precisely the point, since the inevitability wouldn't matter if what was keeping us engaged was the characters. It isn't that it all falls apart. Brooks has a song, as he realized he always wanted to do in his own films, with hope for the best, expect the worst, which is an amusing nod to exactly what this film is about. I feel like somewhere in the story, Brooks connected with its ideas. Having been a poor guy himself, I'm sure he found something in the idea of a guy who felt desperate and might resort to pretending to have epilepsy for some money to be tossed his way. These sorts of themes are in his work, and there's room for that to have been explored in an even deeper fashion. I would give The 12 Chairs a solid B grade. I enjoyed watching it, and I laughed at moments, but something just felt a little bit at arm's length about it too. It's weird feeling that Brooks could have made more story driven, character based fare if this one had gone better. And part of it not fully working was making a second feature in a foreign country. Had he stayed in New York and made a similar tale, he might have found his way more clearly. That doesn't mean the path he went on is bad. Far from it. In many ways, it feels like he very much always wanted to make parody films. Had he made himself more vulnerable, The 12 Chairs could have been a wholly new path, but we'll talk more about Brooks's range when we get to more of his produced works. On the next episode, we'll have one of the most insane double features for any film director. Two movies released in the same year that are verified classics and were both gigantic hits, which nobody could have really predicted after The 12 Chairs. Both movies were from different studios, too, speaking to the uncertainty about either of them being a hit. We'll be talking about Blazing Saddles, followed by Young Frankenstein. That's a double whammy of epic proportions. And I hope you'll join me here on the next episode of Movie Marathon Mood.